Hello, this is David Bernstein. I am the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and I'm here with my partner in thought crime, Brandy Shufutinsky. Hi, Brandy.
Hi, David.
So it's wonderful to return. This is our third episode of Jewish Contrarians. We are two. We are two. Oops. We are two Jewish contrarians engaging in rank contrariness and hideous thought crimes, and we're here to continue the conversation around hideous thought crimes. Actually, we're here for a very serious topic, and I don't want to do anything that would make light of it. Um, it is about, can we discuss gender identity issues? And these are some of the most hot issues in the culture wars. And it seems like there are two sides pitted against each other. There are sort of the trans activists who can be very stifling and very insistent that theirs is the only legitimate way to talk about these issues. And of course, then you have people on the far right like Matt Walsh, or you have legislators in various state capitals who are seemingly delegitimizing the very idea of transness or trans identity or gender nonconforming and so forth. And so I think it's hard for people to have the space necessary to think out loud about these issues, which is what we're here for. We're here to start to be part of carving out some of that space to have the kind of conversations that need to be had. So I'm going to go on a short rant, and then Brandy is going to disabuse me of my wrong think, or maybe not. We'll see. And then we'll allow the conversation to play out. I mean, like probably many of you, I've been watching this unfold, and I thought I'd start with sort of a Jewish instance or because this plays out in the Jewish community as it plays out everywhere else. Recently, there were a slew of bills in Missouri that ranged from preventing trans women athletes from competing in sports to banning gender affirming care to minor. And I think there's a series of other bills that are loosely associated with this issue. And of course, that garnered a response, as you'd expect, from activists and many Jewish activists, including several rabbis who were involved, some of whom even have kids who are trans. And so they feel very personally invested in this issue. So let me just say two things up front, and that is that I'm personally not sure that it's state legislators that should be doing all this. Like, I don't think that that's the job of a state legislator or legislatures to regulate this kind of medical care. But I'm also concerned that our national medical establishment isn't really doing its job in this way. And we can come back to that in a minute. And I also, by the way, and I feel for the parents of kids who are gender nonconforming and who are struggling with this and don't want their kids to feel like that their identities are being erased and like. I understand all that. And yet, when some of these activists use the strongest possible terms to condemn anybody who even questions gender affirming care, I start to think, well, we have a problem here. Like, we can't abide by that. Even if you feel fragile, even if your kids feel fragile, we still have to be able to talk about these issues. We have to allow this discourse to take place. So, and then, of course, by the way, this whole issue in Missouri was made more complicated when Barry Weiss's publication, The Free Press, had a story from Jamie Reed, who works in a transgender clinic in St. Louis. And as what it were, many of the Jews and others who were involved in the Missouri state legislature controversies also happened to know Jamie Reed. She was their caseworker. So it's not like she was a stranger to them. They all feel very burned by her. But she was a whistleblower. She called attention to problems that she saw in that clinic. And I don't think that if she were a whistleblower who confirmed some of their biases, that they would be discrediting her in the way that they have. And so I think she did an important deed. I think it was important that we had this discussion, and we'll see how that all plays out. But Brandy, I'm going to put you in the hot seat. I hope that's okay. You're tough. I have a few questions for you to get us going here. Do you think that there should be gender affirming care? And by gender affirming care, we mean puberty blockers, cross hormonal therapies, and surgeries. Do you believe that there should be gender affirming care for minors?
I think before I get into that with what I think about that, I also want to point out that my concern with all of this starts at first with the fact that we even phrase this conversation the way we did. Can we speak about gender identity? And as a citizen in a free society, I think that it becomes worrisome with the idea that can we even speak about something. I think the bigger question is more how should we be having these conversations? Because I think that there's a real fear that once we start opening up the floor for conversations, it's going to lead to violence and hatred, like we've seen happen before as a result of bigotry, which of course I'm 100% against. I think that these are conversations that need to be had. The question about should minors be able to access gender affirming care is a huge question. And I don't think that there's one answer to it. I think it depends, just like any type of medical care, mental health care, should minors be able to access. I think having one sweeping rule is a little bit harsh, and it tries to simplify something that's very complicated. I think that having a medical professional decide something that may be a psychological or mental health or emotional health issue can be dangerous. And we've seen that this happen before with other issues of mental health care that also lead into some form of physical issue, like eating disorders. So I don't think that there's one right answer for that.
Mm-hmm. So in the United States, we tend to be very affirmative in our gender affirming care. In fact, minors can go to, let's say, Planned Parenthood and under informed consent, often not in every state, not in every place, in some places they can't, can get cross-hormonal therapy without any of their parents' permission. And yet in other countries like Sweden, Finland, Norway, the UK, they've all gone through very rigorous processes that now question their original permissive attitudes toward gender affirming care. And it seems to me, yeah, go ahead.
I think a big difference that kind of gets missed when we're looking at how this type of care is enacted in the United States versus those other countries is those other countries have socialized medicine. So the government is way closer, it has way more regulatory authority in what type of care all patients get. Where in the United States, we're very much a free market medical system. So a lot of times we see a lot of different types of care offered to the public because it's profitable.
That's true, and this is it is certainly big business, by the way, as well. But still we have an FDA, we have a regulatory regime for what we provide people. And what I've read and what I've seen is that our American medical establishment is not having the same kind of debates, not having the same kind of internal process that we're seeing in those European countries that are now having second thoughts and even changing their tune on gender affirming care for minors. Apparently the research that some of us thought was pretty rock solid isn't that rock solid. In fact, it's not solid at all. In fact, it may even suggest that it could do some harm. And so again, this doesn't mean that a legislature should come in and tell a family or a kid who's in the process of getting gender affirming care that you have to disrupt that immediately, or some kind of child abuse, God forbid. But it does mean that I think we should be questioning this and asking ourselves how solid is the medicine.
I think that there seems to be a hesitancy to not only have the discussion, but to have the discussion then lead to research. So if we're talking about medically affirming care, like puberty blockers and cross-gender hormones, then we're talking about something specific that there actually is data that we can follow to see, is this beneficial physically to anyone, to minors included, and then have the conversation about how that can or can't impact their psychological health, which is, that's an important piece of this. I think that one of the issues I have, or concerns I have with puberty blockers, is they're not puberty blockers. They're not just pressing pause on puberty until a kid figures out their gender identity. They're actually used to medically castrate sex offenders. We don't have enough long-term data to show how that will physically impact a child, I think, to say that, yes, it's safe to give this type of treatment to a kid. What we're effectively doing is making minors guinea pigs. And of course, I don't think that that's not ethical. I think I have a deeper question on why that seems to be the necessary care to affirm a child's gender. Are there other things that we can do? You know, the whole idea of first do no harm, that isn't going to possibly lead to some type of permanent damage to that child, both physically and psychologically. And we have those two things out of balance, I think, in the way we're approaching gender identity.
Right. So I'm going to skip to a question that I was going to ask it toward the end, but I think it really needs to be asked now. You know, there's a lot of, all of a sudden we went from having just a few cases like this a year and various gender, transgender clinics and the like to, you know, 100-fold increase. I've heard numbers as high as 4,000-fold increase in the past decade or so in gender affirming care. And so some people are saying, I think trans activists are saying, well, it's always been there in our society, but people couldn't really live out that identity, so they often suppressed it. Maybe many of them expressed themselves as gay or lesbian, but would have preferred to be trans. And so it's like left-handedness. If you have a society that allows left-handedness, you'll see more left-handedness. And they're saying that that's what's happening now. Of course, people, now that they have a greater opportunity to be trans or express themselves as gender nonconforming, they're going to do that. There's another camp that says, yeah, but that doesn't explain why a 4,000-fold increase in identity. And you have there's a lot of parents of 8th grade kids who are talking about, like, oh my God, like half my daughter's class is gender nonconforming or trans or whatever. Is it really? So what do you think? Is there a contagion like left-handed contagion, like, this has always been there, or is it contagion like the hula hoop contagion where people sort of just, like you see on TikTok with eating disorders? What's actually happening?
I honestly don't think we're ever going to know. This is a nature versus nurture conversation. I don't think we will ever really get to a definitive answer on that question, because society is already moving in a certain direction. So we're not going to know what actually spurred it on. And again, that's something that's concerning, because if this is something that is more nurture versus nature, I think it could give us answers on how to approach it and address it. Which it would be wonderful and easy, I think, if we could say one way or the other. I don't think that we're gonna be able to figure it out. I think that we can do comparative analysis on certain places we see it being more prevalent and compare that to other places within the context of the United States where it's not, and kind of try to draw some correlations or maybe even some conclusions on that. But I don't think we're going to get to a definitive answer on that.
Yeah, in 100 years from now, do you suppose that this current trend in gender will be that lots of people are gender nonconforming and it becomes completely legitimized and normalized, and that this is just sort of a process along the way? Or do you suppose that that the sort of moral panic over this would end, and that people won't actually be any different than they are today?
I think that really depends on how we define gender identity. So another one of the concerns I have is that when people talk about, I don't feel like a girl, or I don't feel like a boy, what I would ask, as a social worker, what I would want to know is, well, what does feeling like a boy or girl actually mean to you? Because if the answer involves perpetuating some type of stereotype, then I think we kind of get a little bit closer to what the concern and issue is that can actually be addressed. If the idea is, okay, I don't feel so much like a boy because I'm not into stereotypical boy things, sports, whatever, dinosaurs, cars, whatever, then the real issue is that, well, that stereotype of what it means to be a boy is something that as a society, and even on an individual level as a parent or a teacher, we could address. And the question is, well, is there a way to be a feminine boy or a masculine girl? And I think, some generations past would say, of course there is. My question more goes to, okay, well, now is the idea that no, if you're a masculine girl, then that means your gender identity needs to change. And to me, that's worth exploring. I don't think that that's something that should lead to, again, hatred or bigotry or violence because somebody feels different. But it really comes down to kind of that idea of, well, what does it mean? What does it feel like to actually be a girl? Or what does it feel like to be a boy?
Hmm. Right. And I think we know people who are trans. I have trans friends, and they will say, in some cases, I felt this way my entire life from my earliest memories. And I think we all know that that's the case with a certain percentage of people. But knowing that can be very challenging when you have a 13-year-old. Maybe in some cases, some parents have known since their kids were 3 or whatever, and their kids express themselves in ways that would give you very strong clues that this is very deeply embedded. In other cases, it really does seem like sudden onset gender dysphoria, and that and I believe me, I have familiarity with this on a personal level. So it's not like I'm just engaging in the political rhetoric. I know how that plays out for families. But yeah, I think that's right, and I wish that more people could have the conversation that you and I are having right now. Another question I have for you: do you think that a baby's sex is assigned at birth?
No, this is again something that I think keeps getting kind of, it just devolves into what ends up being a partisan screaming match. Sex and gender identity are two different things. Sex is biological, gender identity is how people feel. I don't think that there should be any controversy in saying that, and I've heard a few people actually say, 200 years from now, when my bones are discovered somewhere, there's scientific testing that can show that I am female. That's something that's just genetic and it's scientific. That again, that shouldn't be controversial. Gender identity again is how people feel, and I think that that's a little bit more of the conversation that people seem to be hesitant to have, unfortunately. But which I think isn't going to lead us as a society anywhere good. It's just going to be people constantly screaming at each other or calling each other names, which doesn't lead to anything positive.
Right. So I think that's a distinction I would make too. On biological sex, look, people sometimes will say, well, biological sex is on a spectrum, and they'll cite the 0.054%, I think that's the number, of intersex kids that don't have either just X or Y chromosomes, or don't have just male or female gametes, and they'll say, see, that's proof it's all on a spectrum. It's not on a spectrum. I think it was Colin Wright who said if you took a nickel, which has a heads and a tails, and you threw it up 5,000 times, one time, it would land neither on heads or tails, but straight up. I mean, again, that doesn't mean it's on a spectrum. The nickel's not on a spectrum. The nickel is either heads or tails. Again, though, as you're pointing out, there is this thing called gender, right? Gender identity. Perhaps it's partially biologically evolved because we evolve as biological sexes in slightly different ways over the course of human history, and perhaps it's also socially constructed. I think it can be both of those things at the same time, but it's neither here nor there. If someone feels that they are a woman and wants to live as a woman, I can't imagine saying or treating them in a way that's different than they identify. And doesn't, the fact that they're still a natal female or a natal male doesn't mean that I have to treat them that way. I've heard people, by the way, people who I generally respect and agree with on some of this, argue that even talking about gender and gender pronouns, which I was going to ask you about as well, it sort of gets us in the rabbit hole of this entire ideology, and they guard against it. They say we're just not going to have a sophisticated conversation about it, and we shouldn't talk about it because once you go down that rabbit hole in the ideology, you end up with the most radical views. Do you agree with that or disagree with that?
I don't. I mean, I think when we're talking about adults, that's a different conversation than talking about minors. I think that if adults want to list their pronouns or not list their pronouns or their blood type or their ethnicity, they're free to. I don't. Unfortunately, it seems to be a bit performative at this point. I don't. I think that part of it comes with this idea that, oh my goodness, if you misgender somebody, that means that you're some type of rabid bigot. Instead of actually allowing people the space that, maybe if I misgendered you, I can say my apologies. How would you like me to refer to you as? Which is a more civil way to actually have a conversation. I don't, but demanding somebody list any part of their characteristics or their identity, acting like someone is entitled to know all of that, I think leads us to this idea of authoritarianism, where people have to wear their scarlet letter or something, visible on themselves so that someone else feels comfortable in not making a mistake, which is, so that doesn't lead to discussion and conversation. I don't understand the point.
Right. And I'm not sure that even if you believe this is the direction of history, right, that this is the way you're going to get there. You're going to get there by allowing people to have conversations. You're going to get there. That's exactly the trajectory of the gay rights movement, same-sex marriage. It happened because people were open ultimately. Not everybody was open, but a critical mass of were open, and they talked about their journeys. They talked about coming out and what that was like. They talked about love, and that shifted attitudes in short order of the average American. I think that has to happen here too, and you're not going to get there by maximizing your institutional power and trying to shut people down. So pronouns, neither of us have our pronouns listed right here. I'm on Zoom with you probably once a day, and I don't see your pronouns, and mine aren't up either. Why don't you use your pronouns? Why don't you declare your pronouns?
I don't think it's necessary. I don't declare anything else other than my name. I mean, my ethnic background isn't listed on my name line. My blood type isn't, how many children I have, or my marital status. I think it's another one of those things. If somebody referred to me by a pronoun that I don't go by, I would correct them. I'm not going to bite their head off and, oh my goodness, they have to be tarred and feathered because of it.
Right.
I don't think it's necessary.
So if you see somebody that goes by they and theirs on their pronouns or whatever else, I mean, whatever else can be a complicated question. But they and theirs, would you respect their use of pronouns?
Yes, I'm not going to disrespect somebody in how they choose to be called. I don't think that that's my right. I don't think that I have that's kind of an entitled position to think that I have the right to name somebody something other than what they choose to be called. Just like I feel like they don't have the right to demand that I then disclose something that I don't choose to disclose. I value very much being a free woman in a free society, and I think that that's an important thing that gets missed. I'm not on the bandwagon for compelled speech. I think that leads us down a very dangerous path.
Right. So if a natal man says she and hers on their pronouns, by using their pronoun, it doesn't mean you're declaring them a natal female. It just means you're respecting the way that they want to be called, which I think is, yeah, and for me too, by the way. Let me just one last curiosity here. If you went to work for a place, God forbid, because we love having you work with us. If you went to work for a place where everybody on their signature on their emails had their pronouns, and that was sort of the practice of the company, would you do it?
No, I've actually been in places where that was the practice, and I didn't do it, and I explained my reason why. But no, there are a few things that I could list that I feel like, yeah, that's, a hill I'm willing to die on. And not being coerced into compelled speech is one of them. We live here in a free society. Honoring my ancestors that fought for that freedom is important to me. I'm not going to be coerced into compelled speech because it makes someone else feel more comfortable. And if someone assumes that because I don't do that I hold some form of bigotry, that says a little bit more about them than it actually does about me.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, so one of my least favorite aspects of this discourse, but we're going to go there because that's what we do, is the role of trans women, especially in women's sports. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. I think that this is one of the topics, this and the idea about what happens in schools are two of the really hot topics where there isn't an easy answer, or there is an answer, but it's not going to be fair for everyone. I think that it's one of those questions that we kind of have to ask and really discuss and think about in the United States, where how far does one's rights go? Do my rights go as far as where they can infringe upon yours? And I think that that's something that unfortunately, there isn't a good answer for that. If somebody who is born male and has gone through male puberty and transitions at 45 or 50 years old, then goes and wants to participate in female sport, which we've seen in things like MMA, fighting and swimming and, soccer, what does that then do to females and everything that they've fought for as far as girls and women's rights in sports, which has been a hard fought battle that is still being fought. And I think that there isn't a fair, good, politically correct answer with that, because at some point somebody is going to actually be treated unfairly.
Yeah, I tend to agree, and maybe it's on quote unquote a spectrum. On this one, maybe it's more like a spectrum. Maybe there's certain sports that I think you more willing to say, okay, that one maybe going through male puberty is not as a decisive factor as another sport. Maybe the testosterone level of the individual can be tested. But I understand why it's painful. I'm sure that, if I had a trans child who wanted to compete in sports, I'd feel that way too. But I also understand if I had a natal female child who was a top athlete, I understand how they feel. So this is a tough one. I don't think that there's easy answers. I know a lot of people have very strong feelings about it one way or the other, but I may sit that one out, as they say, hoping that there can be compromises here or there. Lastly, and this one is a struggle too, should teenagers be allowed to socially transition in schools without their parents' permission? So your 14-year-old, let's say your eighth grader, doesn't want to talk to you about it, or maybe has talked to you about it and didn't get the answer that they wanted, and goes to the teacher and says, I don't want to be he, him, I want to be they, them, and I want to be referred that way in class. And the teacher might say, sure, I'm happy to do that. Or the teacher could say, well, that's a big decision, and have you talked to your parents? And he said, well, no, I don't want to talk to my parents. So what do you think the obligation of the school is, or the teacher is, in that situation?
I think the obligation of the school is to let parents parent. And I think that this is, there are a couple of issues. There are a couple of reasons I feel this way, and it's not actually as a parent, it's as a licensed social worker. I think ultimately the person or people responsible for a child's mental health issues, concerns, are the parents. So not allowing that parent to support their child or get whatever care they would get for their child if they were aware of what was going on in school has led to suicides. It's led to school shootings. It's led to a host of horrific things that I think that we can't expect then teachers to be responsible for the parenting of children. Legally, the teachers are not responsible to parent the child, the parent is. And usually the pushback is, well, what if the parent is abusive? Well, if that's the case, that's where the teacher is a mandated reporter and mandated to report it to the authorities. But that doesn't give a teacher the right to say across the board, I'm going to decide for my students what would otherwise be a parental responsibility.
Right. And you don't view a parent that denies their kid the right to define their own pronouns as a kind of abuse.
No, I mean, there have been, again, I could go on and on about horror stories as a social worker I've seen dealing with child abuse. It's not that hasn't led to abuse. Multiple things have led to abuse. That doesn't mean that the school steps in and makes that decision for the parents. That's when the school has to take responsibility as mandated reporters to make sure that child is safe. But you can't do kind of just in case that this may happen, I'm going to, as a teacher, replace the parent to do what I think is best. And also you have cases where teachers don't know everything that's going on. Just because a student sits with them in a classroom for a few hours a day, they don't know all of the other things that are going on behind the scenes that a parent may be aware of, that may be a red flag of something else going on with that child.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Well, listen, it's 29 past the hour, and we just had a conversation on the biggest third whale, perhaps, in the culture wars today, which is gender identity. And I think we did it with nuance. I think that if you thought that because we're on one side of the culture war or the other, that we're going to come down in a very predictable manner, I don't think we did. And I think we probably mostly agreed on these issues, but probably there's a few nuances here or there where we might have parted ways. And I think that's how this conversation can be had. It doesn't have to be in the most extreme voices, and And it doesn't have to mean just because you open the conversation on issues like gender care, it inexorably leads to the kind of transphobia that people are scared of. Yes, there will be instances of it, but it doesn't mean that that will automatically happen. And if we don't allow it to happen, there can be no social progress. There can be no empathy. There can be no real understanding. So anyway, it's 12:30. Thank you, Brandy, for that conversation. And Shabbat Shalom to everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.